We're very glad that you can join us to bring together and reflect on the discussions and the debates that we've been having over the last 3 days. The theme for the event has been between precarity and possibility, implications of disruption for Earth system governance. As Agni mentioned in the opening plenary, we chose this theme for several reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, because we're living in a highly disruptive time right now, which we're all trying to make sense of as scholars. Secondly, to recognise that where the world moves from here does not begin from a blank slate, but is conditioned by pre-existing structures, power relations and ideas, at the same time as new possibilities for radical change might emerge. And thirdly, to foreground people, and especially to recognise that experiences and consequences differ for different groups and across different places. Our collective inquiry into these issues was initiated marvellously by our keynote address from Professor Rachel Kite, who spoke about the need to both shore up existing systems to get through current dislocation, at the same time as we build the systems that are fit for purpose for the next 20 to 30 years. So, in this final event of the virtual forum, this is now a perfect moment to reflect on what we need to do and what we need to be thinking about going forward. To do this, we have a remarkable panel of scholars with us who will engage in a moderated conversation on these issues. With us on the panel are Professor Karin Backstrand from Stockholm University, who is an expert on global environmental politics, the role of non-state actors in climate change governance, partnerships in sustainable development diplomacy, and democratic legitimacy in global governance. Professor Chuks Okereke from Alex Ekweme Federal University, who is an expert in global climate justice and corporate climate strategies and green economic transition in Africa, and who also has extensive experience engaging with national governments, businesses, and NGOs. Associate Professor Thomas Hale from the University of Oxford, who is an expert in transnational governance and the evolution of political institutions in the context of globalization and interdependence, and spanning both environmental and economic dimensions. And Dr. Janina Grabs from ETH Zurich, who is an expert in the governance of sustainability in global value chains, with a focus on tropical agricultural commodities and the effectiveness of private sustainability governance. We're truly delighted to have you all on the panel today. The panel discussion itself will be moderated by Dr. Åsa Persson from the Stockholm Environment Institute and a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project. For now, Åsa, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And actually, before we dive into this panel discussion with these 4 scholars from our community, just wanted to explain how it will run. So we'll do probably 2 rounds of questions with the panelists, but then we want to bring in some reactions from the audience, questions, comments, provocations, ideas, in the live Q&A box that you will see on your on-air window. Hopefully you know how to use it by now. It has been working really well, and please also engage and upvote questions and comments that you think are particularly important. So we'll get to that later in the discussion, but let's just dive right in. We had an excellent framing there from James, the theme of the conference, and of course we're in the middle of this crisis now, so we are speculating. But I heard in one panel that someone said that speculation is undervalued, so let's evaluate it. And we're going to start with the same question for all 4 panelists. It's a mini survey with 4 respondents, if you like, but we are really grateful that we can, all of us kind of mirror our own thinking in theirs at this point. So the question is, what is the one biggest negative implication that you see from this crisis? And what's the one biggest positive implication, if at all? And also, if you could comment on what kind of timescale you see these implications playing out. Are we talking about a short blip in the status quo, or are we talking about really long-term structural change, transformative change, whether for the better or for the worse? So that's a big question, but let's dive into it. And I'd like to start asking Karin to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Åsa, and thank you to inviting me to this wonderful panel and the virtual forum. It's very important and urgent questions. So the first question, what are the most negative? That's hard to select one, but I gave it some thought, and beyond the obvious candidates of endangered to planet health. So I think, given that both the health crisis and global environmental governance or global environmental threats are these twin big global collective action threats, we really need the multilateral and international regional institutions to handle them. And what I think is a very big negative is exactly the threat, the rampant nationalism that we saw in the beginning of the COVID, the geopolitical grab for protection and medical equipment, because multilateralism is for the weak. And the attack on the institutions, the nation's withdrawal from UN, we see with Trump's leaving the WHO, that is a threat, because a crisis, the pandemic and the ongoing climate crisis, they really reinforce existing disparities, global north, global south. So I think a kind of, besides the obvious direct negative threats, negative implications for health, all the sick, all the people who die, and of course all of the in the shadow of COVID, there is of course many states who take the opportunity to actually dismantle forest protection, roll back. But I think the importance here, and I want to actually move forward to that we really need to build up the infrastructure of multilateral institutions, of EU institutions, so we can respond have a collective response to this double threat, because both the pandemic and climate change, they are deadly threats, long-term, short-term. So to retain our institutions and build them up, and to end on a more positive note, there was, for example, in the EU in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this very nationalist impulse, but then there were mechanisms for burden sharing, and it improved as the pandemic unfolded. So I think, was I going to talk about the positives too, Åsa, or the positives? So the positives, so I mean, a crisis means a turning point, and I actually think there is and it has said before, a window of opportunity to do a transformative shift, to address both the pandemic and long-term climate change through this green recovery. And I think it has shown, the pandemic, that actually we as human beings are very adaptable. We can switch very quickly to transform our lifestyle and actually make a sacrifice in terms of our individual freedoms. And now I'm talking about freedoms to travel and all of these, so to speak, not basic needs, for the solidarity and to protect others. So I think that is a positive thought, and I think that can be, that transformation of our behavior, our traveling modes, our lifestyles, it shows it can happen very quickly, and to fight the pandemic, and also to mitigate the climate crisis. And as you said, Åsa, look, we can sit here and have these debates in a virtual conference, saving and reducing climate emissions. So this is my hope for the future. And also to comment on the EU, I think it's very interesting that now with the EU, the Green Deal and the climate law, that there was fear in the beginning that the Green Deal should just be abandoned, but actually through leadership that has been retained. So I have some positive perspectives on the possibility to fight this pandemic through the green recovery. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karin, for kicking us off. So I took note here, the threat to multilateralism, maybe the most worrying negative implication, both for climate change and the health crisis, but also quick behavior change as a positive. We're gonna now move to Chucks, who is with us on audio. Oh, excellent, video as well. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
Have your go at this question. What's the negative and positive implication?
Well, for me, the most important negative trend and that is continuing to undermine our ability to respond to global environmental challenges remains for me the hegemony of capitalism. The idea that attendance or solutions to environmental crisis has to be predicated on economic prosperity, and not just economic prosperity, but economic prosperity defined in particular terms, more production, mass consumption of resources. I think that despite the attempt by many of us here and allies in the civil society and business sectors to redefine sustainability, standing on the triple balance of environmental health and integrity, economic prosperity, and social equity, the idea that both environmental and social equities are sort of secondary goals, and that all of them have to, they only make sense if they support economic growth, remains the most important force that we are fighting against. Because initially the idea was that, okay, the science wasn't clear if you're talking about climate change, and eventually I think the science is overwhelmingly clear that human impact on the environment has grown, and in a negative and devastating way. And even when, and I support what Karin said about the threat to multilateralism, but I try to go like, what is the reason why some people in the US, for example, Donald Trump, continue to try to undermine the science of climate change? In my view, it is not necessarily the threat to multilateralism, although that is, for me, that is a secondary, that is the second, if you like, in the layer. The fundamental problem, I think, is that general commitment to economic, macro, neoliberal economic growth defined in certain terms. And this is why it's difficult to really embrace policies, if you like, radical policies that will, that can push for better environmental sustainability across the globe. The positive line I see, apart from the excellent one that Karin already outlined, is the growing awareness from the young population. I know that Extinction Rebellion, there's a move now to tag them a terrorist organization. I hope it will fail. I think about the excellent work that has been done by the young lady, the young girl in Sweden and all other parts of the world, in mobilizing the young people to begin to take seriously civic action in favor of climate change and environmental protection. And I think this is a very exciting time. We've seen the Orange Vest movement There are, of course, some political complications in terms of defining what that movement was about, but you cannot remove a certain level of awareness of the people on the need for government to take radical action on these issues as a major force. So I think if we can find a way of overcoming this hegemony neoliberal economic market as the main thing, the biggest altar to which all other environmental objectives must bow, then we are on our way to actually mobilizing for a more effective action on climate change and generally global environmental governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So a more system critical perspective. That's what I heard. Continued hegemony of capitalism as the sort of, well, actually underlying that threat to multilateralism. So I'm curious to hear if, Tom, if you agree with this sort of more systems critical view, or you see other kinds of implications as negative or positive at the moment.
Thank you, Essa. It's always a pleasure to speak after Karin and Jux because you learn a lot, but also a challenge because they say all the good things and you have to add the footnotes to their excellent views. Let me, though, try to think of one important positive and one important negative that I think may not have been emphasized yet. On the negative, I think what the COVID crisis has really shown us is how weak our current governance systems are. Even in the face of a challenge that was seen coming, every government had a document sitting on their shelves saying that pandemics were a risk and here's our plan in response to it. We all were prepared for this risk in some sense. Even with that, and even with the huge urgency around it, we've seen really different responses from governments. Some have responded effectively. Every government, I think, can respond effectively. It's not like we can't do this. There are plenty of good examples to point to, but many governments, including some people think of as particularly capable, that would rank very high on a political science indicator of state capacity, haven't done particularly well in terms of controlling the number of deaths. And that, I think, gives us real pause as we look down the century to come with all the challenges we're going to see driven by a worsening environmental crisis. This is not a good sign. I think we should all find that very sobering. The positive side, though, is I think we've seen, it actually speaks quite directly to Chuck's, your point around the sort of nature of capitalism here. I think we actually have seen in the last few months a big change in people's willingness to rely on the state for intervention and protection. And this kind of builds on a longer term trend, not disconnected from the work of the Fridays for Future movements or others to emphasize a Green New Deal for the planet. But I think we actually see, when faced with crisis, people's views on what the appropriate role of the state should be have shifted. And who would have thought a year ago, that we'd be seeing governments spend as much money on economic stimulus as they are now. Now, we know that they're not necessarily spending that yet in the right way to drive a more sustainable, robust system going forward. Some are using it to prop up incumbent industries, but it does create the potential that actually we could realize a kind of political economy of transition that was never going to be possible before. And I think that's a really important, probably the most important opportunity to try to seize out of it. I mean, the sad fact is that we see both of these positive and negative tendencies happening at the same time. And so I think we really are at a critical juncture in the specific social scientific meaning of the term, that the choices we make now will be very determinative for the choices that are available to us in the coming months and years and decades. And so I really hope we will make better choices in the next few months than we have in the last few months.
Thanks a lot. So you point to also the key role for national governments in responding to these multiple crises. Maybe government is back. There is that willingness to rely on government, but also we have shown or this crisis has shown the weak capacity. Maybe we can come back to that later in the discussion. But now we're going to Janina to hear your take on these questions.
Sure, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. And echoing Tom, it's always difficult to come towards the end of an excellent panel talking about the same question. So I might be echoing some thoughts, but I think also adding some new ones. Firstly, I want to open with the fact that I think 2020 to me is really the year where we're seeing multiple compounding crises hit and hit and hit. It's not just COVID. It's also wildfires, hurricanes, ice sheets melting, murder hornets, in addition to political deadlock, economic shutdowns, and not to mention the continued plight of economic and other migrants, for instance, the ones affected by the fire in the Moria camp on Lesbos. And I think this, unfortunately, might be a taste of the future, as many of these crises are interdependent. They are going to be compounding each other, and they are going to be worsened in intensity and in how often they occur by climate change, as we have indeed been warned by scientists for decades. And so also, I want to acknowledge that in real time, it's quite heartbreaking, I think, for all of us to witness this human suffering, the suffering of wildlife as well, and the reinforcement of inequalities at both global and local scales. And so even if myself and others are privileged by our position to not be affected directly in a material way, I think it takes an emotional toll on scientists, on policymakers, on the public at large that we shouldn't underestimate, especially moving forward. And then more broadly, it also appears to me that we are entering a new era of increasingly reactive rather than proactive Earth system governance challenges. That is, we're responding more and more to the immediate symptoms rather than being able to treat the underlying causes of Earth system collapse. And this, to me, threatens to divert the attention and also the resources by governments, by businesses, but also the attention of the public, right? To focus on more short-term relief, short-term issues, more immediate problems closer to home rather than the ones abroad, and rather than the ones that are interrelated and connect us to each other. And so there's also this threat of increasing nationalism that Karen mentioned. I think that is that we saw in the beginning that may have redeemed itself a little bit, but I think as these crises continue to hit, I'm really scared about that element. On the positive note, I think it was Churchill who said, right, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that spirit was really well captured by Rachel Kite in our keynote address, where she said, why rebuild the old world when we wanted a new one? And so the fact that we're having this economic breakdown and need for recovery at the same time as we're seeing now in front of our own eyes that there are climate change related crises that are coming to the fore, I think is making politicians a bit more responsive to giving the economy a restart and resetting the tracks and maybe overcoming some lock-ins that we thought we were stuck in before. So it's kind of this external cause punctured equilibrium that would allow us to move the tracks in a different direction. And I think, for instance, the European Commission President's address yesterday to the European Parliament, connecting the stimulus and recovery packages to increasing ambition within the European Green Deal can be seen as like one step in the right direction. But of course, other and opposite interests may also take this adage at heart, right? And so we really need to fear and be wary of a pressure for continued environmental deregulation, as we're also seeing happening around the world.
Thank you very much, Janina. I believe it was just in one of the previous panels, Matthew Hoffman said many interesting comments that also these windows of opportunity are perhaps social constructs. So they are there, but it's really up to societies, centers of power to sort of define how long they are, how big these windows are, and what they are, open to. But that was really interesting as a start to hear about the threat to multilateralism, the sort of continued hegemony of capitalism, multiple crises, compound crises, and also that our states and governments are perhaps weaker than we thought. So we're gonna continue with a few questions to our panelists, but I also really encourage you to put in your questions and comments, ideas, reactions in the chat box. on the on-air system. So going back to you, Karin, you talked about multilateralism, and of course we know by now that this year won't see any of the big COPs. It won't be that super year that we had been sort of expecting for climate, biodiversity, oceans, and it's going to be a very, very packed agenda next year. So if you think about the end of 2021, end of next year, basically, where do you think we're going to be? Will these meetings have happened, and what will they have led to? And will this time we have now before these meetings, will it be used in a productive way?
Thank you. Yes, this is the million-dollar question. And I want to enter it first because I think that's the elephant in the room. I mean, the prediction for end of 2021, we cannot avoid the question of the outcome in the US election, because again, the world is held hostage to what's the election. And I think, of course, what the second largest greenhouse gas emitter, that is US, the administration will have profound impact, also given what I said previously of the importance to have a strong, inclusive multilateralism. So that will be a very critical juncture. But if the outcome there will be positive, I would say that actually there are some positive, if I'm going to take an optimistic track here. Comparison to the financial crisis, there are three conditions that make a better prediction for 2021. In 2019, we had the Greta Thunberg movement, and not only the movement because it was big, but how the movement have shifted public opinion in major countries. So the climate change was on the top of the agenda before the crisis. That was not the same during the financial crisis. Secondly, I think, I mean, maybe Jacques will be critical to this, but and I think that is correct. But I think there is another debate now within business and industry, an acceptance of climate change and a transformation and a momentum. And thirdly, which links to what Janina and also Thomas said, a greater acceptance for government intervention. So all these three factors, I think, will push, and that we had in the EU, the Green Deal in place before the pandemic, that will, I think, will be a positive force. Now, obviously, there is a delay there will be at least half a year or 1 year delay because of postponed meetings. The ramping up the NDCs for UNFCCC will be delayed. And of course, there is always this risk that countries now put up other issues on the agenda, of course, saving jobs, set that before climate change. But and maybe this is more a hope, that I hope that these things will create better conditions to arrive to a stronger and more ambitious targets, NDCs, strong in the EU 2030 targets and a new climate law. And then I want to say one thing also that I think is different from 2008 and what maybe is positive for 2021. Environment and climate is now put it's not in a silo, it's put beside in green industrialization, just transition, and the coming together of this. And I see the European Green Deal, and it was very clear in the State of the Union with yesterday with Ursula von der Leyen, that bringing this together, it is a larger ecological modernization discourse, of course, and with all the caveats for the rhetorics for that, it is a kind of green capitalism. And Jacques, I agree with you that we should be criticized to that. But that, I think, to the end for 2021, that the environment and climate is not siloized, and the debate on just transition, that I think bode better for the end. So, but these are hopes, of course, and I agree also with what Janina said, that there is this danger of this multiple migration crisis, the climate crisis, the economic recession, and the health crisis. There is always this danger that government will only be able to look at one or two at the same time, but hopefully in a package. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. Thanks for the commentary from your dog as well.
Yes, he's getting a bit...
he sounded optimistic.
He's cheering.
Yes, of course, very uncertain, but we're all trying to understand the future now. That's quite an obvious trend too, actually. A lot more governments are doing foresight than ever, I think, partly as a response to this crisis. I wanted to follow up with you, Chucks, on your, you made a bold claim, and I was wondering if you feel that, in this debate, and I think we are all part of it, sort of writing our papers, op-eds and so on, perhaps to some extent our voices are heard, but whose voices are not heard in this debate? How do we move forward on these multiple crises?
Yes, I would desperately hope that Karin is right. I would, how I wish to share in her optimism. But I feel very unable to rouse myself to that level of optimism. Because from where I'm sitting, things are looking quite grim. I mean, in Nigeria, the projection is that the country will lose about 75% of the projected earnings as a result of COVID because of the plummeting of oil prices. In Kenya, over 70% of the projected revenue from tourism is going to be lost. In Zimbabwe, the amount of number of people that are going more into poverty is increasing because of the loss of revenue from agriculture. And Africa have been shouting that COVID-19 should serve as or the impacts of COVID-19 on African economy should serve as a wake-up call that our growing debt is becoming very, very unsustainable. And I have called on the Chinese government and the European government and the US government to urgently consider rescheduling and indeed forgiving much of African debt so that we will be able to stand a little bit of a chance to recover from COVID. But already a number of Africans are beginning to default on their debts, including to China. And these have significant, serious ramifications, even for the sovereignty of African countries. Because there is a precedent, of course, that if we're not able to pay, China can walk in here and seize one or two of our public utilities and begin to manage it to recover their debt. I don't think that African voices are being heard enough. This is a crisis like no other in Africa. Of course, some of the projections that Africans will be lying on the streets as a result of COVID have not eventuated. By a confluence of events, maybe our weather, maybe some kind of resistance internally, I don't know. Africa has more or less escaped the sort of grim projections that were made in terms of the loss of lives. But the projections in terms of the economic and social impact, I think are beginning sadly to be realized. Just yesterday, the labor union in Nigeria issued a call that the whole country will be shut down if the government does not reverse itself, because the government has slapped 100% increase in tariff on electricity bill, on energy bill, as well as on customs and as well as on fuel, petroleum, gas pump prices. These are people that are just trying to come out of the impact of the COVID-19, or countries around the world are making an attempt to give palliative to their citizens. But Africa has nowhere to run to, with some of them operating on budget that has about 45% devoted to debt servicing. The greatest impact that the developed world will now have on Africa is to sit down and talk about debt rescheduling so that Africa can begin to find space to recover from the devastating impact of COVID. And let's not also forget that this thing is harder now, as Karen already told us, because of the threat to multilateralism. Nobody has spoken about Brexit. I was expecting Tom to pick it up since he's there in Oxford enjoying the smooth ride of Britain out of Europe. And now we have seen that some countries are willing to tear up international law for the protection of their own economic gains. And so we don't know what's going to happen with Brexit. Of course, I agree with Karen that the outcome of the US election will also be very, very important. But quite frankly, oh, by the way, I have been privy to see some of the NDCs that are being revised. And quite frankly, they are just a recycle of the old stuff. And in some places, some countries are beginning to weaken the commitment they've made in the last round, saying, well, actually, we don't have to think more about our economic recovery because of COVID. So I'm not at all optimistic that this newly revised NDC will represent a ratcheting of ambition in any form or shape. And in any case, from African countries, we know that from the analysis I have done for the African Development Bank, not one single African country had what it takes to actually keep to the promise that they made in the first round of NDC. So whatever you see on the table is going to be just mere talk. And without the ratcheting up of climate finance, capacity and infrastructure, there is, I find it hard to see where I can clutch my hope on.
Thank you. So more pessimistic assessment from you. And I recall actually in the spring that the African Union was hailed as much more successful than, for example, the European Union in the early response to the pandemic. But as you point out, maybe the second order effects, economic crisis are hitting Africa harder. And also you raised the issue of debt, which I guess we could see as maybe the flip side of that more optimistic Keynesian sort of let's use government spending for climate targets, decarbonization, green deals, etc. Very important issue. We're going to go next to Tom again, who you I think focused on national government level. You can of course elaborate on that, but I wanted to ask you, also knowing that you have worked on this Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker, looking at what governments actually do to try and mitigate the pandemic. What has been most surprising to you, and what kind of, are there any reflections or insight that you could transfer to climate governance, environmental governance?
Great question, Elsa. So first, I think, Chuck's raises a really strong challenge, which I think is really important, that this is a real crisis. Like, we shouldn't underestimate the critical nature of the state of the world at the moment. I think, though, what I find helpful, Chuck's, and when I look at the very dire situations you've elaborated very clearly, what I find interesting there is to think about what are the things we can do that can move us in the direction of ameliorating some of these effects. And if we're at a critical juncture, as I think we were suggesting in the first round of questions, that's really important, because if we don't push a little bit further toward the better scenarios, we're going to be into a kind of spiral where things are just going to get worse and worse. And I think, they're already extremely bad, as you've described very clearly. We need to think about what are the positive things we can do. And that's, so, I think where we've tried to focus in this Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker that you mentioned, is trying to track what governments are doing or not doing. And as I said before, it's led to some very surprising insights of which countries have actually managed this crisis well and which haven't. And if you look at kind of some leading examples, we've all, of course, heard about New Zealand, which probably most people expect to do well on a kind of crisis like this. But look around just the immediate borders of China, where countries that were exposed very early on in the crisis actually have managed it extremely effectively. Mongolia, Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan, these are all places that have responded extremely effectively, often in some of those cases with very little resources. Or look in Africa, Botswana, Senegal have done extremely well managing cases, building on community-based healthcare approaches that were developed for other crises. Look in Latin America, Cuba has done extremely well in controlling the cases, also through a community-based healthcare system. And even in the United States, a country that has not distinguished itself on any dimensions of governance in the last 4 years, look at states like Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, New England states. They're significantly different, right, than the other parts of the country. They've actually managed to flatten the curve and keep it flat, even as some European countries haven't been able to do so. So this is a really, I think that level of granularity really matters, because the point that you take from that, the takeaway is that we can actually do this. It's not impossible. Some surprising governments have managed to control it well, or surprising if you have a sort of, old view of what makes for effective governments. So I think there's a message of hope there that actually it's not inevitable. It's maybe rare, but it's not inevitable that we would be stuck in this kind of crisis. And that hopefully gives us some hope from other ones as well. What I think is, perhaps if I could suggest a limiting factor, and this goes to you, Chucks, your thought about the smooth process of exiting the European Union. I think governments that I think have done poorly have often not listened to evidence, have not paid attention to what experts are saying, have not studied the example of others, have perhaps thought they don't have anything to learn from others. I think that kind of hubris is a risk factor in this sort of crisis. And political leaders who indulge in such hubris are really putting themselves and their countries a higher degree of risk. A final point, just to think about the non-state actor side. I've been really surprised, for example, this goes a bit to what Karen was saying, on the huge number of net zero targets we're now seeing amongst subnational and non-state actors. Some of them are, of course, propaganda or PR, but actually a lot are being set in a really different kind of way. I mean, I would never have guessed in 2015, when the idea of 1.5 degrees was somehow shoehorned into the Paris Agreement by vulnerable countries working and activists, how that idea could have so much traction that today, 5 years later, we're in a situation where, at least on a rhetorical front, huge multinational corporations are embracing this idea. It's really a norm shift that I think shows how quickly these kinds of things can change. Now, of course, we need to make sure these are not superficial claims, and we need to call out those that are superficial claims and expose them. But if you just look at it as an example of how quickly norms can change, I think it's a positive message to take away. None of those positive points, though, of course, underline what you were saying, Chuck. So this is indeed a crisis. This is a critical moment. We at our peril, ignore that. But given that, I think we need to find those rays of light to build on, because otherwise, it's going to get a lot worse.
Thank you for that. So we're now going to go to Janina again, and we wanted to, you're obviously very welcome to respond to comments by the other speakers, but also we were curious to hear what you think about what are the new research questions that are being posed from these, from the pandemic, but also these multiple compound crises. As a scholar, maybe in the earlier part of your career, what do you feel that your sort of research agenda is shifting, and also what do you think in light of the broader ESG community, the research lenses we have, do we need to rethink, or is it just sort of a new reality to apply our existing research questions on?
Thanks, Åsa. So yeah, I was reflecting a lot on this question while I was attending a number of really interesting sessions these past 3 days. So it was a really nice lens to sort of focus my insights. And what I think my answer is that it's not necessarily lend distinct new research questions that our system governance community has never thought about, but it's definitely shone some new light and also lent some new urgency to the questions that we have asked before. And indeed, one of the reasons that I give this answer is I think the new ESG science plan, which came up pretty recently, I mean, was already created in the context of some of these issues, and I think allows us, even in the pandemic, to take a pretty good starting point to reflect on issues related to it. So starting from the contextual conditions of the Anthropocene, transformative events that happen, and inequality on different scales, to asking about how best to adapt to such conditions, and also to use our imagination to anticipate new futures, as well as thinking about implications for democracy, justice, and power relations. So I think overarchingly, it provides a quite robust frame to look at this new crisis. But I do want to highlight two themes that have popped up with greater urgency in the sessions and also my own thinking, and may receive a bit more attention in the future. So the first is the relationship again between short-term crisis management and long-term system redesign on a political and societal level. So Rachel Kite in the keynote spoke of scaffolding the old system while employing cathedral thinking to reimagine a new one, which is a great analogy. And I'd like to propose maybe a second one even. Like, to me, it's almost as if we're asked to transform a plane into a helicopter while in midair and keeping airborne. So it's a huge challenge to think about this new system and how to transition to it while maintaining the support of our citizens and the trust also that things will go into a direction that benefits everybody. And I think it's a really difficult path for politicians to scout and for citizens and also businesses to support. I think we could use some more scholarship on what types of governance architecture and agency can lead to a successful balancing act in this sense, and what the role of democratic processes and other forms of citizen engagement are in this task. And reflecting just at the last session before we came to the plenary and the working group on economic downturn and climate action, Matt Hoffman made a very strong claim that we cannot go to business as usual if we're thinking seriously about the Earth system, and we cannot, like, it's not an option to go back to the status quo. So how do we move forward? And I think actually talking more to the scholarly community on sustainability transitions, as well as the community engaging with prosperity without growth and degrowth in ecological economics could be really fruitful in that sense. And the second theme that I saw is the question on how international solidarity can happen when every nation is facing simultaneous crises. And this speaks to what Chuck's mentioned. We know that acts of solidarity between the global north and south are already difficult under normal conditions. And many of the speakers in the forum have emphasized these past days the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and other global crises on the nations and actors that have fewer resources, less technological know-how, less structural power, while nations in the global north first and foremost look to safeguard their own people before turning to others. And yet, I think COVID-19 has also re-emphasized that it's not just about nation against nation in that sense. It's also shown the hidden inequalities inside of nations between individuals at a larger scale, individuals that were more marginalized due to their socioeconomic position, their education, race, gender, or other factors have suffered disproportionately, while other individuals actually benefited from the crisis. So for instance, America's billionaires saw their wealth increase by $434 billion until now, while we're in a global pandemic. And so here, I think we could do more work in expanding the array of actors to theorize on and hold responsible when we're thinking about global solidarity, and also place close attention to the relationships and power dynamics between governments and firms, but also wealthy individuals and their philanthropic endeavors or not, and how they are contributing or not to the sustainable development goals and global justice, and what we could do to rectify that situation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And yes, I was at Oxfam who released a report just a week ago on the profits that Amazon has made so far in this crisis, and highlighting the sort of income inequalities we're facing. These were really interesting responses. We are now gonna see if we have some questions and reactions and comments from people listening in. Unfortunately, we can't have you, report them directly, so to speak, in a mega Zoom. So James is gonna convey a few to us.
Thanks, Åsa, and thanks so much to all the interventions from the panel so far. It's incredibly fascinating to see the issues that you're raising and from all sort of different perspectives and some of the common themes and all the complementarities as well. I've got many questions I would love to ask myself, but there are also some very highly some highly rated questions in the list. So I'd say we go to those ones first. The highest rated one that we have so far is from Christina Inoue, who asks basically about translating the need for transformation into new institutions. So new norms, new rules and procedures, and specifically speaking to the economic dimensions that were raised in several places. And perhaps, Chucks, maybe you might want to go first on this. It's sort of asking about, I guess, how do substantial or significant or transformative changes become institutionalized, and what might that look like?
Thank you very much. I think that's a cracking question. I don't think I have a satisfactory answer to that. In my view, the problem has not always been the absence of institutions, but it has been that the norms, the objectives, and the goals to which those institutions feel most compelled to adhere to pursue, have not been the ones that are serving the interests of planetary justice, of sustainability, of climate action. We are not where we are because the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the Security Council are dysfunctional in terms of their design and structure, but because of the lack of fairness and equity in the processes, the lack of equality in voices, and most importantly, because those who have control of the powers, the voting powers and the shares, are particularly concerned much more about the economic prosperity than global sustainability and justice across the board. We have now a situation where about 3 or so African people are fighting to become the next secretary of the WTO. Africa has not occupied that position since the creation of that institution. We have eminently qualified individuals from African extraction. But I also am aware, without disclosing so much, that there is a significant fight by certain forces to undermine Africans' ability to lead the WTO. Let me also remind the audience that just recently, this is not a secret, so I think I'm free to say, that the United States of America put up a powerful fight to undermine the second tenure of Dr. Adesina as the leader of the African Development Bank. This is the one institution in Africa that have AAA rating from all the lenders and have distinctively powerful record in helping to address the issues of poverty and economic underdevelopment in Africa. And yet, without any substantive evidence, there was an attempt to undermine the leadership of Adesina because he put his foot, that's our understanding, that is the narrative we have here in Nigeria at least, that he tried to resist certain hegemonic policies coming from some powers that be. So, and we see what happened in terms of the WHO. WHO is still campaigning as we speak for COVID-19 vaccines to be made available to Africa free of charge. I didn't think that this bears argument. I think this was self-evident that it has to be. And yet we have economic forces battling against making COVID-19 vaccine available to Africans free of charge. We had long fight before the generic versions of HIV/AIDS medicines were made available to Africa, whilst people, the pharmaceutical industries that have patents to these drugs reaped off the world and made billions of dollars in profit. So the institutions, in my view, are dysfunctional, not because they cannot perform, but because their ability to perform are undermined by those same forces that I already spoke about in my first and second interventions.
Thanks for that response. Which in a way I think echoes what Rachel Kite said in her opening, that it's not, it's very difficult to build new institutions in times of crisis. So rather it's about putting up that scaffolding to make existing one work, including perhaps then removing these dysfunctional or forces making them dysfunctional, let's say. James, are there any other questions to the panel?
Certainly. We have one here which is directed towards Janina, which is about trying to grapple with the compound crises that you spoke about, and just in our own sort of work and our own heads, I guess, how we make sense of that and how we try to get a grip on that, to try to, I guess, make meaningful inroads on these problems that we sort of recognize, but how do we kind of get a grip on that? There's a question that's speaking to that issue.
Wow, yeah, it's a really good question. I think to me, interdisciplinarity and working with different people that have different expertise while also reading quite broadly, like from a scholarly perspective, is likely to allow us to see the interconnections between the crises easier, and also to alert policymakers to them, right? So for instance, my own work focuses currently on corporate supply chain management to prevent deforestation. And from the ecological community, we know that deforestation and increasing encroachment of people into formerly wild areas actually leads to more zoonosis, because you have more pandemic, you have more diseases that are spreading from wild animals than domesticated animals, and then to humans. And so I think it's quite interesting to me that in the research focus that I have, a lot of NGOs have raised this point. So I think our scholarship is also getting better at sort of connecting previously unconnected issues together, and also then empowering actors that may focus like not on COVID prevention directly or fighting COVID, but they see that the efforts they are making to actually protect forests may have some substantive outcome even in the health area. And a second example, or a second theme, is that I think in our community, it's really nice to have people that are focused on so many different issue areas and coming together to allow us to talk about the economic implications. There's some people that know much more about economic institutions and systems than me, for instance, and being able to bring those ideas of systems transformation back is really relevant in my eyes. But like, how do we solve them all at the same time? If that's the million-dollar question. In my work, I still focus sort of on the strong sense of sustainability, where you have the ecological sustainability as the outer and founding condition of then social sustainability, and then the economy at the core, right? If we have an economic system that continuously contributes to overreaching planetary boundaries, I don't think that we'll be able to solve any crisis whatsoever. And any short-term shoring up of it will be a patch, and we're going to continue kicking the ball down the road and letting the next generation deal with it. So in my opinion, I think we need to have more of an understanding of the ecology, but also the socio-ecological elements of recovery in order to have a strong economic system that will continue to be functional in the long term.
James, do we have maybe a couple more questions and then start wrapping up?
So it's very hard. I'm trying to make links between some, but it's quite hard to do. So that's why they're sort of coming out one by one. So there's another couple, actually the next three also, or two of the next three again speak to kind of economic issues, which is really interesting as this is coming up so strongly for so many of the panelists. And in fact, this actually came up in the Stockholm Plus 50 Science Policy Dialogue last night, which is the prompt for this question here. Mentioning that the ambassador from Sweden who spoke last night talked about wanting to make sustainable production and consumption a key theme in the agenda going forward. But one of the other panelists mentioned that this might not necessarily be feasible in a sense because some countries, such as the US as mentioned here, would perceive it as an attack on lifestyles. So the question is, if certain lifestyles are part of the problem, how can that be tackled politically?
Great question. Does anyone in the panel want to have a first go? Janina, go for it.
I'm sure Karin can have a go.
Let's hear Janina first and maybe Karin after that.
Sure. Well, I think my answer would be, and I look forward to what the other panelists have to say. My answer would be that not all lifestyles, right? Not all lifestyles are a problem, even within certain countries. And that I think we need to make a distinction again between those who are more economically vulnerable and those who are less so. And what we actually do see is that in terms of sustainable consumption, we have certain elements like the upper 10 or 20% of income in any country that or mainly in the global north, but like in the global north, the ones that are quite prosperous, who are contributing to the most overconsumption in that sense, right? Consumption that is not useful to meet our needs, that is only being used to sort of keep up our status. And I think in some of those countries, we have made inroads in sufficiency ideas and maybe the pandemic in a limited sense has also given some new input on I can vacation at home. I can spend more time with my family and friends rather than going to travel around the globe to pursue the same kinds of experiences. But I think we do need to make a strong distinction between people that are currently struggling to make ends meet and not conflating that, oh, and also in terms of like green recovery, you need to cut back more, because I think that's going to create a lot of political backlash. But yet, trying to both encourage like finding pursuits and even leisure time, like having leisure time as a higher priority rather than increasing income and increasing consumption. For the 10 to 20% of highest incomes, changing that mindset would already make a big impact.
Thanks a lot. Did you want to comment, Karin?
Yes, thank you. Very important question. And I actually want to echo a bit from I listened to the wonderful workshop yesterday about Stockholm Plus 50. And I want to echo Frank Bierman, if he's here, with sustainable consumption, where actually Sweden is one of these very affluent welfare states who are far away from complying with that. I believe very strongly, as to echo Frank, there has been carrots and sticks. There has been too much carrots, too much soft steering. We need regulation, we need taxation, we need bans to ban fossil fuels. So I think this is very central. I also agree with Janina that, and now I'm only speaking for the in terms of lifestyle, the affluent middle classes. I think the crisis have, I mean, taught us that in terms of slowing down, not having this enormous stress with traveling. And I reflected on that myself, how much more productive you can be by slowing down. There are also evidence, again, not from all families, but that there is actually more in some segments of the population, better mental health because families can be together. So again, saying this with all the caveats that, of course, those who are socioeconomic exposed, it's worse for. But I think there are good, there will be hopefully long-term effect that we can appreciate a slower lifestyle, less on material consumption. But I think these harder steering instruments, bans, regulation, taxes, will be very important. Then I want to say one thing which connects to the economic and maybe the institutions in the previous question. I think it's extremely important now when so much money is poured into rescue package, recovery, I mean, unprecedented on national, EU and global levels, that they really are climate and secured, because that there is a set up institutions as mechanism to really see that, for example, that 30% of the EU rescue package go to climate investments, go to the fund for just transition. So we are not locked into the carbon economy like we did after the financial crisis. So set up institutions and instruments to steer, to see that the recovery is actually going in the right direction. And finally, I think this with the just transition, there can be no climate, effective climate governance if you don't address the distributional issues. And so we need that on both the national level, the European level, to compensate for those who will be, as we will phase out fossil fuels, and on the global level. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. I wanted to just ask Tom at this point. We're connecting a lot of dots now in terms of themes and issues that have come up during these 3 days. But you made a point earlier that, especially with this government response tracker, you could see that there is some, or I'm not sure it was a conclusion from the tracker, but you were making the point that there is a individuals are willing to rely on governments to take certain responses. Connecting that to the issue of, more sustainable lifestyles, can you at all, or have you started looking at any sort of correlations between, which countries have imposed more sort of bans, regulations, and if that could say something about the public acceptance for sort of environmental regulation going forward?
Yeah, it's a really important topic and question. I think the evidence to date shows that people are much more likely to embrace even costly changes in their own lives if they feel that everyone else is doing it too. We as social scientists understand this kind of power of norms to set expectations. But what we've seen in some COVID research already is that even a small amount of non-compliance or kind of the view that everyone else is not doing something quickly changes people's attitudes. So when the message is, this is a great crisis, we're all in it together. We've heard the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, says things like, we are a team of 5 million people all working together. That kind of messaging does seem to be the kind of normative shift that allows people to really sacrifice for the community. When you get into a situation where that sense of solidarity isn't there, that people are actually worried about others' non-compliance, then people become much less willing to make the sacrifice. That's of course been a short-term effect, right? We've seen these kind of people's compliance with these various policies erode over time in many places. But the message I think we can take for climate policy or for any sustainability policy is that people need to feel that their actions are part of something bigger than themselves. And that's where I think the kind of movements we see for Fridays for Future, et cetera, really can be the things that will finally change, because if these kinds of lifestyle shifts are something that those other kind of people do, those weird environmentalists do, then I don't think this is going to be a big part of any kind of solution. When it becomes something that is totally normal in society, then it will be. And the exciting thing maybe is that those kinds of transitions can happen really quickly. And I think we might be hopefully seeing some of them emerge with this crisis.
Thanks a lot. Chucks, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, quickly, I just wanted to thank whoever asked this question about sustainable consumption, because you can believe that even when I'm in the midst of highly educated friends of mine from the West, and I begin to talk about the need for global solidarity to tackle the sustainable development goals, or if I want, and I say sustainable development, and people just come back at me as if sustainable development is something for Africa, and I have to point to them quickly that unsustainable consumption is part of what the SDGs are supposed to address. That sustainable development is not an African agenda. It's not an agenda for Bangladesh and Maldives. It's an agenda for everyone, and that the West has to get a grip on I am because I consume, I am because I buy. Otherwise, we will not get a grip on any big theory on sustainability, because after all, as I said, this consumption is very well tied to economic models that put mass consumption at the highest level of economic scale of development. Go back to the classical models of development that we taught people in year 1 and 2 of geography and economic classes. We need to come to grip, we need to deal with this issue of mass consumption. And I want to echo what Jenny also said, because I was interviewing one of the popular news media yesterday, and I talked about the issue of mass consumption and the need to cut down on meat consumption. And the guy was livid and said, does this apply to Africa as well? I said, well, not as much as it should apply to Europe, because at the moment, average meat consumption in Europe is nearly 400 times more than Africa. So it's important that when we talk about sustainable consumption, that we're a bit more granular, and that we don't push any agenda that further marginalizes those that are struggling to achieve their required intake of protein in Africa. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very good point there. And we're gonna see if we have time for maybe one more question or comment before we wrap up. So James, do you have anything?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's there's a nice one here to finish on. I think that everyone can perhaps speak to about urgency and in some senses actions that can be taken immediately. What would some of these actions look like? The question specifically mentioned to strengthen international solidarity, but I guess you could extend this across the whole discussion. I guess, yeah, what would be the reactions of the panel on that question of, we are in this intensely urgent moment. What would some forward steps or positive steps towards some sort of transformation look like to you?
Who wants to start? This is a tricky thing. How do you start a transformation? Tom?
It's a great question. And I think my first thought of it goes back to the earlier question of what institutions might we need to build up here. I think there's a huge research agenda for us in the Earth Systems governance community to move much more into the political economy space, and specifically the global economic governance space. And I think if we research climate policy in the decades 1990 to 2000, 2020, maybe we would focus a lot on the UNFCCC, on the global, the Green Climate Fund, these kinds of things. If we research climate policy in the next decade, I think we'll focus a lot more on the WTO, the IMF, the national development banks, and all of the structures of global economic governance, because we need to align all these rules with a positive, sustainable transition, and one that will make us transition away from unsustainable practices, but also to build resilience against the kind of crises we're now experiencing. And that requires changing those rules. And so I think, I would love it if the climate conferences in years to come aren't called climate conferences, or don't happen in the sort of environmental space, but actually are part of the mainstream economic discussions. And so that's will be a challenge to each of us to actually try to move from our current community, this lovely community which can't be together this year, but is a really nice scholarly community. We need to become less comfortable and to move into spaces that are not ones that we've occupied before. So as a hope that all of you will study things like, how do we implement border carbon adjustments in a way that's drives environmental sustainability while also driving economic justice goals? How do we research reforming corporate governance law so that corporations' charters require certain kinds of outcomes as part of the conditions of being incorporated? How do we change how do we create an ISO standard for net zero compliance that becomes the de facto standard for industries globally? And those are the kind of questions I think we need to really and can work on and have a lot to contribute to, and seem to me a very productive way to focus going forward.
Thanks a lot. Really good call. Great research questions there. Janina.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great question. I think from my side, reflecting back on this window of opportunity that's currently open, where there seems to be a bit more space in the economic sense of how we envision a future after this pandemic, and the finances that nations are willing to put on the table right now. I think it's really important to strongly advocate for the fact that we need to make politicians understand, citizens understand, that a new system will only be sustainable if it's different from the previous one. As again, echoing Matt Hoffman, to put the message out that the status quo is not a way forward, and that also, if there is money put on the table, that not only, I mean, it's nice to see that a third of EU funding is going towards climate change investment, but that as much money as possible is linked and integrated with other types of commitments that nations have made. There was also a report recently that nations have not met their biodiversity protection targets whatsoever. And again, seeing the integration of all of these issues, I think this time is critical to make politicians understand that they cannot continue to see the economy as isolated, not only in terms of being it would be nice to commit some of this money towards also our environmental targets, but to recognize that if we move forward with a novel economic system that is different from the system that we had that has contributed to this crisis, we need to put all our eggs into that basket.
Thank you very much. I think that was a really nice final comment from the panel. We have run out of time, and I'm not going to attempt summarizing this discussion. It was really rich, and I think reflects really well how we're all making sense of what we're currently experiencing, and trying to connect that to our work, and also trying to live this reality. But one thing, just to say something, I think what I heard from the four of you was, I mean, both reasons for pessimism and for optimism, that we are in these multiple compound crises. We haven't seen the end of them yet. It might likely get worse with these cascading effects, migration, economic crisis, debt, etc. However, the positive thing I take with me was the speed of norm diffusion and norm institutionalization can sometimes be quicker than we think, and it seems to be an important trigger of transformation. So again, really want to thank you for sharing your thoughts. And with this, I hand over to James.
Thank you, Åsa. I would very much echo everything that you said, and thank the panel members and the moderator very, very much for this wonderful session, and for sharing your thoughts in such richness and honesty. I think one thing that has really stood out for me, just maybe to add one thing to what Åsa mentioned, one thing that's really stood out to me from this whole virtual forum is the rawness of these issues that we're all kind of grappling with and struggling to make sense of. Yeah, we really hope that the forum has been useful in some way, working through these issues together. And of course, it's just a first step, because this is going to remain with us. But this does seem like a really perfect completion to the virtual forum. So thank you very much to the panel. So this now closes the panel component of the session. And I would just like to hand over to Agni Kalfagianni to say the final words from this 2020 virtual forum.
Right, so really it was extremely interesting and insightful closing plenary discussion. Thank you for leaving us with these many thoughts and ideas. It is very clear to me that we as Earth System Governance scholars have a lot of work to do in the years to come. I would like now to thank everyone who made this virtual forum possible. First of all, I would like to thank our keynote, all our speakers, chairs, and organizers of the plenaries, semi-plenaries, and innovative sessions that took place over the past 3 days, as well as the conveners and participants of the 7 more meetings that will take place tomorrow. And of course, all of you, everyone who participated in the forum during the past 3 days. We hope that you enjoy the discussions and that you will remain part of the Earth System Governance community of scholars for years to come. Second, I would like to thank the entire organizing team and the technical support staff, starting with Gustav Tungren, the Managing Director of the Earth System Governance International Project Office. Gustav, may I invite you to join me here, please? Over here. So, Gustav, you had the immense task of transforming our regular annual conference, which was to take place in Bratislava, to a virtual event. And so you became an expert in online platforms, tools, communication, integration, etc., in very little time. So Gustav, you did an amazing job. We are grateful for all your hard work and dedication, and we know, and everybody we hope knows, that none of this would have been possible without you. So we'd just like to give you some flowers, and we also have a small present that I will give you later.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. If you could please stand here so that all 3 of us close this session. So Gustav was supported in this task by numerous individuals. I would like to acknowledge Felix Zielinski, Kieran Reimer, and Charlotte Steinen, who provided support from the International Project Office. John Proctor, our corporate communications advisor from Utrecht University, who helped us tremendously with the preparations and actual execution of this forum, and who managed to sneak in the flowers this morning without Gustav realizing it. The team of student volunteers who offered incredible help and support throughout the forum. Ashima, Alaya, Anushri, Avalon, Leonie, Max, Thomas, Mona, Nikki, Carol, Luisa, Kivan, Julia, Sarah, Brian, Marinus, Riza, Namera, Franca, and Melanie. Thank you so much. And of course, Arnold, our studio technician, who is also here with us today and who has been taking care of the cameras and sound of the opening and closing plenaries. Thank you so much. Last but not least, I would like to thank our hosts, Utrecht University and the Earth System Governance Project, and our co-hosts, the German Development Institute, the reInvent Project, and the TransGov Project. We are grateful for your support. And I would like to end and leave you with an invitation. Next year, around the same time in September, we hope that we will be able to have our annual conference in Bratislava and meet each other again face to face. The theme of next year's conference is Earth System Governance in Turbulent Times, Prospects for Political and Behavioral Responses. We hope that you will join us in Bratislava. Please stay tuned for any news and updates. For now, and from all of us, I would like to thank you, wish you goodbye, and see you soon.